Welcome to Spruce Grove Alliance Church, your home.
I want to remind us that we are in a summer series that we are calling Somebodies of the Old Testament. And this is where we're looking at significant characters of the Old Testament who were essentially nobodies, but God worked through them because they surrendered to God, and He, through them, did extraordinary things. And so we're looking at these characters, and one of the coolest part about all these characters we're going to be looking at is that they are very flawed people. They're super flawed, just like you and me, and that's encouraging to me. I don't know if it's encouraging to you, but it's encouraging to know that God can work through very flawed people to accomplish His purposes if that person will surrender to them, give their lives to the Lord, and let the Lord do what He wants to do through them. So I want to dive into another Old Testament character this morning, and just have us look at what can we glean from the life of that character, and what lessons can we learn for us today and how our lives may be very similar. And so we're going to be talking about the story of Jacob today. But before I jump into the story of Jacob, I just want to remind us, I think this is very important for the message today, is to be reminded that the Bible is not a story about us. It's not. It's a story about God. We are like the sub-characters in the story, right? The story is God's story that He is writing by His power in His time, and He chooses to work through people. Just like He chose to write the Bible through human agents, so He chooses to accomplish His will through us if we make ourselves available to Him. And so I want to take a look at the life of Jacob and Jacob's story, because Jacob is a story of how God was able to use a very flawed person, bring him to a point of surrender, and through him to achieve great things. And if I had to summarize the story of Jacob, I would summarize it as striving. You know, he is working very hard, striving very hard his whole life to try to achieve his destiny that he felt that God wanted for him, but constantly failing and constantly having to learn the lesson again and again that he can't do it by himself, but God is going to do it His way and in His time. Really, I think the whole story can be summarized in the word surrender. It's all about letting go and letting God, which I actually think is a great slogan for the entire Christian life, right? Our whole Christian life is about learning again and again, let go and let God. And so let's look at Jacob's story. His story begins way back with his grandfather, Abraham. You know, Abraham is a very famous character in the Old Testament. And Abraham was a man that God chose. He chose Abraham, and then He came to Abraham, and He made a promise to him that He was going to make Abraham into this great, mighty nation, that his descendants were going to be like the stars in the sky, and that through this mighty nation, He was going to bless the whole world. So He was going to bless Abraham to be a blessing to the world. And God made it very, very clear right from the outset to Abraham that it was not going to be dependent on Abraham and his abilities and the things that he was going to do or anything his descendants did or didn't do. But God was going to fulfill His promise to them through His power because He just chose to do that. But it doesn't take long before we're into the story where we see that there's a big snag. And the snag in the story to fulfilling God's promise here is that Abraham's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah, they can't conceive. So this is a problem, right? Because they're going to be apparently this great nation. And how can you become a great nation if you don't have any children? And so in desperation, they pray out to God. And Isaac, as the Bible says, the Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. Now this is, of course, the father of Jacob. So at the very beginning of Jacob's story, what do we have? We have right at the outset, God showing that it's not about what you can do, but it's about my miraculous power, because He caused Rebekah to become pregnant even long after her childbearing years. God was saying, I can do a miracle, I can make it happen by my power. And I mean, how many times have we been in situations like this? Situations where we're banging our head against the wall. And we're saying, God, I don't get it. I'm doing everything right. I'm doing what I think You want me to do, but nothing seems to be working. And then we need to be reminded again and again by God, it's not by our strength, but it's by His Spirit that He's going to do it. And man, that's a lesson I've been taught a lot of times. Again and again, He reminds me He's going to do it in His time. And that's the story of Jacob. In the same way, God reminds his father, Isaac, and his mother, Rebekah, that he is going to fulfill his promise that he's going to be a great nation by his power. And so she gets pregnant, and in her womb is 2 twins. This is what God says to her when she's pregnant. 2 twins. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people from within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger. And then as the story goes, Rebekah gives birth to these twin boys, and Esau comes out first. He's the firstborn. And Jacob comes out right after him, grasping onto his heel. And so they decide to name him Jacob because the name Jacob literally means heel catcher. And this is very important in the story because in Jewish idioms at the time, to catch someone's heel was a metaphor to overtake someone or trip them up so that you could supplant them in a way. It was like using your own cleverness and strength to overtake another person and take their place. And so this has quite a lot of significance to the story because in those times, the rightful heir was always the firstborn, right? So in this case, even though they were twins, it would have been Esau because Esau came out first. So Esau was the rightful heir. But because of this prophecy that the younger was going to be the one who the promise was going to come through, and because of this heel-catching scenario that we had at the birth, they decided to name him Jacob because they probably assumed that God is going to achieve his purposes through Jacob's line and not through Esau's. And Jacob had a strong sense of this growing up, and he wasted no time trying to make this promise a reality. And so he uses trickery and scheming, and he ends up basically tricking his brother into selling him his birthright, and he also takes from him his blessing. Because the firstborn would have had a double inheritance in terms of material possessions, and he would have also had the birthright or the blessing, which basically was the title of the leader of the family. And so Jacob took both of those away from him, his material inheritance and also his title as heir of the family. And in Genesis 27:36, it says it all. It's very telling. This is Esau speaking. He says, "Isn't he rightfully named Jacob, heel catcher? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me." So twice Jacob takes advantage of him. And what's really important to note here is because of this, Esau gets super angry at Jacob naturally, and he vows to kill him. And so Jacob's forced to flee. So Jacob, by trying through sinful and deceitful methods to make God's plan happen, he actually ends up delaying God's plan and now has to flee to a foreign land for who knows how long. And how many times have we done this even in our own lives, right? We're trying to make God's plan happen, through our own efforts, and sometimes through doing that, we actually make things harder for God, and he has to work in spite of us. And this is exactly what happens in Jacob's story, right? He makes some blockheaded decisions, but despite his blockheadedness, God is gracious to him, and he visits him at that point in a dream. And in this dream, there's this wonderful stairway to heaven, and God comes to him, and he reminds him that he is still going to fulfill his promise to Jacob. It might take a little bit longer, but he is going to do it by his mighty power because he promised to do it, and he's going to do it in his time, and it's not going to be through Jacob and the things that he does. And I think what we got to notice here is that God is emphasizing I am going to do it through my power and my way, not you, Jacob. I mean, I get this. When commentators look at the story, they always point this out, that God is clearly emphasizing his power to accomplish his promise that he made. But Jacob, he doesn't seem to be getting the picture here. He's not picking up on it. Because right away, he goes on to do the exact same thing he's always done. Through scheming and through planning and through hard work, he's trying to make it happen. And so he tries to make himself very wealthy. As soon as he gets to this new land, he's acquiring wives and children and livestock, because he's going to be this great nation, right? So he's got to be wealthy. He's got to, grow his family, so to speak. And because the Jewish people were nomadic people at the time, wealth was directly correlated to how many children you had and how big your flocks were. So he gets to work acquiring these things, but he meets his match in his father-in-law, Laban. Laban is also a deceitful schemer, and you see the story how both of them are wrestling together through these very cunning schemes that they have to try to outwit the other one and try to get ahead of the other one. At the end of the day, they both end up actually quite wealthy, but Jacob has the lion's share of the wealth. But then God comes to Jacob and he tells him very specifically that all of the wealth you have and all the success you've experienced, it's not because you're so clever and you had this very ingenious breeding strategy, which is what he thought was making him wealthy. And God said, no. You're wealthy because I blessed you, because I promised I was going to make you into a great nation, and so I am doing it and had nothing to do with the things that you did. And then God tells him one last time, he says, okay, you've done what you can do, now it's time to go back home. It's time to go home, to face the music, take your rightful place as head of the family, and to fulfill the promise that I made to you all those years ago. So Jacob tries to do this, but along the way we see that Jacob, despite all of God's provision, and actually visiting him multiple times and telling him that he's providing for him, he still can't trust God. He's still lacking a lot of faith. Because as Jacob begins this journey, it's said that his brother Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. So Jacob hears about this, and it says he had great fear and distress, which shows us that he's still lacking faith. He can't trust in God. Specifically in verse 32, verse 7 to 8, chapter 32, verse 7 to 8, Jacob says, in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and the herds and the camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the other group will be left and may escape. And so here we see that Jacob's not trusting in God because he's scared, and he again tries to devise some kind of clever plan. But he's obviously come to the end of himself, right? Because the plan he devises, unlike all of his other plans, it's not a winning scheme. It's not like, if I do this, I'll come out on top. It's really a plan of damage and mitigation. Maybe I'll just lose half of everything I have and be killed. That'll be the best case scenario. So he's admitting that there's no good way out of this situation. He is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He has no strength, no ability to be able to save himself. So finally, he is broken. God breaks him, and he's distressed. And he finally surrenders, realizes that he has to let go and let God. And this, my friends, is exactly the place that God wants him. A.W. Tozer, he was very well known for saying always that God cannot use someone until he breaks them. And I think that is so true. God cannot use us until he breaks us. So he had to break Jacob, and in this moment, he breaks him. And in this moment where he's totally broken, where he's come to the end of himself, he does something for the very first time that he's never done before. It's the first time we see in the text that Jacob prays to God. I mean, God has spoken about him. He's spoken to him multiple times, given him visions and dreams and all this stuff, and he's been guiding his hand all along. Yet this is the first time that Jacob actually turns to God and speaks to him. So let's pick up where we left off. This is his prayer in verse 9. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness that you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed the Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. So here we have, for the first time, Jacob is acknowledging that all the blessings he's had in it and all the wealth that he's accomplished and achieved, that this was not because of his hard work and clever planning, but it was because of God. And he thanks God for these things. And he now acknowledges he's in a situation that he can't get himself out of. And he again prays God and says, God, you got to save me. And you made this promise to me, and you said you were going to do it. And now I'm trusting in you that you will do this. And this, I would have to say, is the main point of application here. This is the point I want to drive home to you. You can take this one away from you throughout the rest of the week. If you were to take nothing else away from the sermon, take this thing, and that is prayer. It's pretty simple, prayer. right? To stop trusting in your own efforts and your own abilities and turn to God in surrender and ask him to show up. Because prayer is the ultimate instrument of surrender. It's saying, God, I can't do it, but you can do it. So God, would you show up by your grace, by your power? I need you. I call it pulling in the oars and putting up the sails. Sometimes we need to do that. We just need to put up the prayer sails, so to speak, and just let the wind of the Holy Spirit drive us where we need to go. How important is that for us to learn? How easy is it for us to forget that? How many times have I forgotten that lesson? And so as the story goes, this night after Jacob finally surrendered to God, something very extraordinary happens. Let's read what took place that night. That night Jacob got up and he took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" Jacob, he answered. And the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw the face of God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Okay, so here we see a very magnificent scene, right? It's really the culmination of the entire life that Jacob has lived up to this point, right? Up to this point, he's named Jacob, means supplanter, heel catcher. And the most important thing is to look at here is the change of name, right? He's been called Jacob because he's been his whole life catching people's heels, trying to climb the ladder, so to speak, by his own clever scheming. But now he struggles all night with this very strong man who he can't seem to overcome no matter how much he fights him. And then the man in an instant touches his hip and he wins the fight, which shows Jacob that at any moment this man could have ended the fight. And so he wasn't actually fighting with a man, but he realizes in that moment that he's been wrestling all night with God. And isn't that a beautiful metaphor of Jacob's life? His whole life he thinks he's wrestling with men, Jacob. But now God calls him Israel, which means one who struggles together with God. He was always struggling with men, but actually he realizes his whole life he wasn't struggling with strong men. He was all along struggling and striving with God. And once Jacob finally surrenders, he finally gives up the struggle. When he has no more strength and no more ability to be able to fight, he just clings on to this man. That's all he can do is cling on to him. And in that moment, in all of his weakness, and all of his surrender, and all of his inability, that is when God chooses to bless him. It's interesting, isn't it? And how true is this in our lives? Jacob, he finally learns this lesson that God's been trying his entire life to teach him. If you just have faith, if you just trust in me, I will bless you. I will do it. But you got to get out of the way first. Now, perhaps some of you here, you've had a similar experience. Maybe it's your Jacob story. Maybe your whole life you were struggling to try to fulfill what you felt was God's purpose for your life, but it seemed like the more you struggle, the harder it was. Like you were just beating your head against the wall. Like, what's going on here? And then God finally, like Jacob, brought you to the end of yourself, a place where you were forced to surrender to him. And it was in that place that he met you. It was in that place that he finally blessed you. That, my friends, that's your Jacob moment. And so what is it? What is your Jacob moment? My Jacob moment, I can remember quite clearly. It was about 14 years ago. At that point, I had for quite a while sensed what I felt was a strong calling on my life to go into full-time ministry as a pastor. And so I had been working towards that, but there was one very big problem. No one would hire me. And I discovered you can't be a pastor unless someone hires you to be a pastor. You call yourself a pastor, but no one else will. No one else will. So it was discouraging to me, to say the least, right? And I had been, at this point, 5 years trying to find a job. This was 5 years after I had graduated from my undergrad, so I was technically qualified. I was licensed. I could become a pastor. And I had been looking for 5 years. Nothing came up. Nothing was working out. I had even gone back to seminary to get a second Bible college degree, even though I had said I would never go back to school again until I had gotten some real-world pastoral experience. I did it because, churches prefer people to have, prefer their pastors to have a master's degree. So I thought, okay, I'll go do that while I wait. And I can remember when God broke me. I was entering into my very last semester of my second degree. And I had just lost a very promising position. So I'd been interning at a church. They had promised to hire me, but the funding they were going to use to hire me had fallen through. So they couldn't hire me anymore. So I'd lost this job that had so much potential. And I was angry, and I was frustrated to God. And I was saying, God, what gives here? I mean, my friends are getting jobs in ministry, and a lot of them had less of a call on their lives. And a lot of them hadn't worked half as hard as me. Yet they're getting these jobs, and I've done everything right. I had done all the right things, all the things you're supposed to do. I had worked very hard, and I said, I deserve this. What's going on, Lord? And he brought me to a place where I finally I broke. I surrendered, and I said, God, I give up my dream of being a pastor. I've been trying to do it. I can't do it. If it's going to happen, it's going to be because of you, and if you want it to happen, great, but I'm not going to try to make it happen anymore. And I remember the day I broke because I wrote in my journal this: God, I'm done trying to become a pastor. I can serve you wherever you place me. Even if I work as a Walmart greeter for the rest of my life, I will serve you in that. And so I surrendered. At the time, I was a delivery driver because it was during the Christmas holidays. I just had to make ends meet. And I remember a couple days after I had this surrender prayer to God, I remember it clearly, just like it was yesterday. I had just done a residential delivery, and it was in Edmonton somewhere in an older neighborhood. There was all these 60s bungalows there, and I had just come back into my delivery van, and there was a field with trees on this side, and I get into my van, and I got a call. This is back in the day when you still would use the phone to call people. And I picked this up, and it was the call I had been waiting 5 years for. It was a representative from my denomination telling me that there was a church that wanted to interview me to be their pastor. And the rest is history. This was my Jacob story. And what I have found through just having lots of conversations with people, and actually it's all through the Old Testament and New Testament, this is a pattern of how God chooses to operate. He loves to operate this way. He loves to bring us low, to bring us up. His mode of operation is quite upside down from this world's mode of operation, right? He loves to bring victory out of defeat. He loves to bring life out of death. He loves to bring strength out of weakness. As he told the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians, he says, my power is made perfect in weakness. That's God's mode of operation. That's just how he operates. Now, maybe you're asking, like I was asking at that time, why, God, do you choose to operate that way? I know this is how you operate, but my goodness, why? Why? And the answer, I think, lies in the very first point I made in the sermon, because it's his story. It's his story, it's not our story. Right? If we were able to do it by our own effort, then it would be our story that we are writing. But if we can only do it through God, if only God can do it when we surrender and give up, then it's God's story that he writes. And this is actually so perfect, because if we were to do it by our own power, what would happen? Well, we would become very proud. Well, look at how good I am. Look at how smart I am. Like Jacob, he would have been like, see how clever I am. I figured it out. But no, God brings us to the point of surrender so that he can do it, so that we don't become proud, but instead we become worshipful. Right? Because we actually look at the situation, we go, there's no way I could have done this. There's no way I could have brought this about. God clearly did it. in his timing, by his power. And so thank you, God. It doesn't make us proud, it makes us grateful for God and all that he has done for us because he provided this for us. I didn't achieve it. And at that Jacob moment, at that time when we choose to surrender to him, that moment where we choose to let go and let God, something very significant happens in our lives. We go through an identity change. Remember, a name always speaks to identity, an identity to name. And so when God changes Jacob's name, he's changing his identity here. He was a heel catcher, someone who strives very hard to get ahead of other people. But instead, God says, no, you're going to be Israel. I'm going to give you a new identity. And this means someone who wrestles and strives with God. But what's very important to know, and it's super interesting, is that through the rest of Jacob's story, which spans many chapters, through the rest of the book of Genesis, the author of Genesis keeps flipping back and forth between calling him Jacob and calling him Israel. And all commentators will mention that this is not an accident, but this is a very intentional tool used by the author to show that Jacob is constantly going back to his old identity. Who he was, his old mode of operation of trying to do things by his own strength. And I think, isn't this so true for us? I mean, how many times have we done this? How many times have I done this? Again and again, I forget about my Jacob moment, and I start trying to do it on my own. I mean, how many times in my life has this happened? So many. But thankfully, God gives us a gift. It's the gift he gave Jacob, a gift that is always there, always present to remind us that he is in control, to remind us to let go and let God. For Jacob, it was his limp. We still call it a limp. We all have a limp. We walk with a limp. This is a good thing. It's a gift from God. This was a gift from God to Jacob because it was always like an ever-present reminder to him that he can't do it. I'm sure every time through the rest of his life when there'd be some issue and Jacob would try to get up and go and try to fix this thing, the hip would be like there reminding him, the limp would be restricting him, holding him back and reminding him, okay, that's right, not by my strength, but by God's strength, just like how the whole promise came about. And also, it always reminded him of the change of his identity, right? Because remember when he got the limp? It was the night that God broke him, the night that he surrendered. He was about to face his brother Jacob, who had 400 men. It's not a welcome party, that's an army. Now, maybe Jacob thought, that he could somehow fight with Esau, maybe still overpower him in some way. Because, this guy must have been some kind of physical specimen. At 97, he wrestled all night long, and he was still going. This guy was strong in his own right, but now he's got this limp, and he's disabled, he's crippled, right? He can't go into this fight, so he's lost even a sliver of hope that he's going to come out on top by his own power. And so he's forced to surrender to God, and he says, God, if your promise is to come about that I'm going to be the father of this great nation, it's got to be by you. It's got to be by some kind of miracle that you make this happen. And as the story goes, the very next day, Jacob, he limps to meet his brother Esau, and the text says, but Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So God did a miracle. He totally transformed Esau's heart, regardless of all the things that Jacob did to try to make him upset. He softened his heart, and he fulfilled his promise, and Jacob became the leader of this great nation, a nation that was blessed to bless the entire world, all other nations, which of course we know came through Jesus, because Jesus came through the line of Jacob. And we here today, 2,000 years later, on the other side of the world, we are a living testimony to the fact that God did bless everyone through Jacob, because Jesus has blessed all of us in our lives. And so then my question to you is, if God gives us a gift of a limp, what is your limp? What is it? What is that time, that situation, that Jacob moment where God reminded you that he was going to do it by his power and not by yours? For me, it's always constantly been trusting God with my career and my calling. Many times since my Jacob moment, I've been in situations where I thought to myself, okay, if I do this and if I do that, I'll secure my job, or I'll be able to advance my career in some way. But then God would be telling me something else, and I'd be like, well, if I do what God wants me to do, what's right and what's good and what's righteous, it might actually hurt my career advancement, or might actually cause me to lose my job. There's been many times I've been in these kinds of situations, and I was finding it difficult to trust in God. And then God would remind me of my limp. He'd remind me of my Jacob moments. And he would say, remember when for 5 years you did everything you could possibly do to try to become a pastor, and you couldn't do it. And then finally when you surrendered to me, I did it in a couple days. He says, remember that? He says, and am I not the same God? Am I not still powerful to do that? If you do this thing I want you to do, and am I not capable enough to secure your job? Or if you lose your job, am I not capable of getting you another job or a better job? I can do it. Trust in me. Submit to me, and I will do it so that I get the glory. So that the glory is properly assigned to God where it belongs. You see, my friends, we're always going to be tempted, just like Jacob was, to go back to our old identity, our old mode of operation. But we must always walk with a limp and remember how when we surrendered to God, he showed up in big ways and he got the glory. It's his story he is writing through us, not our story. So let us trust in him. Let us let go and let God.
Thanks for listening to this week's message from Spruce Grove Alliance Church. For more information or to hear past messages, please visit sgac.net.